Welcome to Globalheadwinds.com, your go-to space for deep dives into geopolitics, global economics, energy, and climate change. Today we turn the spotlight to one of the world's most dangerous ongoing conflicts, a war that, if not resolved soon, could have grave consequences for all of us. But before we dive in, don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoy this podcast and share your thoughts in the comments box. Now let's talk about the Russia-Ukraine war, dragging into its fourth year with no clear end in sight. For decades after the Cold War, Europe enjoyed relative peace. But that illusion was shattered in February 2022 when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Suddenly, Europe was plunged into a war unlike anything it had witnessed since World War II. Where does this crisis stand today? And could it set the world on an irreversible course? From day one, the war sent shockwaves across the globe. Oil and grain supply chains collapsed. Europe, heavily reliant on Russian gas, scrambled for alternatives. African nations dependent on Ukrainian grain teetered on the edge of famine. 3 years later, the fighting grinds on. There was a cautious optimism when President Trump returned to office. His reputation as a deal-maker raised hopes for a ceasefire. But Vladimir Putin, entrenched in his campaign, shows no signs of backing down. Perhaps from Moscow's perspective, he has little choice. If Russia withdraws, NATO forces could move into Ukraine, placing the Western missiles right at Russia's doorsteps. For Putin, that's the red line, much like the US drew during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 when President Kennedy stopped the Soviets from stationing nuclear weapons in Cuba. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky insists his country's security depends on joining NATO. Can we blame him? For Kiev, NATO membership may be the only shield against a full-scale Russian occupation. The result, a deadly stalemate. But beneath the headlines lies a grim reality. Ukraine has become a testing ground for Western weapons. Defense contractors in the US and Europe are funneling arms into the conflict, not just to support Ukraine, but to refine their own technologies. In effect, Ukraine is now a laboratory for modern warfare. The price? Human lives. Cities reduced to rubble, soldiers on both sides treated as expendable data points in the race for the next invincible weapon. Adding fuel to fire is Trump's decision to sell advanced weapons to European NATO members who can then pass them to Ukraine. This move relieves American taxpayers from directly footing the bill while funneling billions into the US military-industrial complex. But European arms manufacturers are far from happy. They risk losing out to their American counterparts. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Russia is clawing away chunks of Ukrainian land, now occupying over 20% of the country. Ukraine's manpower is dwindling, while Russia, with its vast population, continues to draw on deep reserves. There is another issue that has started creeping into Ukraine. The country has gradually started showing signs of war fatigue, the prospects of which are certainly not so bright for Zelensky. On the other hand, as the West props up Ukraine monetarily, the Western economic sanctions are gradually hollowing out the Russian economy. So here's where things get really intense. Trump, desperate to end the fighting, has thrown down a hard deadline. Either get to the negotiating table within 50 days or face even tougher actions. And he's not stopping there. If Russia doesn't budge, he's threatening to slap 100% tariffs on countries that keep buying Russian oil. And who are those countries? They are China, India, and Brazil, who alone account for about 21% of the world's oil consumption. They would take a massive hit. But it's not just them. As you can see in the chart, the European Union and Turkey are also huge buyers of Russian oil and gas. Now here's the kicker. Trump hasn't said a word about how this move would affect America's allies in Europe. And that silence, it's only adding fuel to the fire, geopolitically and economically. Because cutting off Russia's oil isn't just about China or India. It could send Brent crude prices skyrocketing and trigger a global inflation shock that no one, not you, not me, would be immune from. In fact, the data from the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air shows just how crucial Russian oil exports have been. Even after the war started, and despite heavy sanctions, the cheap Russian oil helped keep Brent crude prices from spinning out of control. Meanwhile, as the clock ticks down, Putin may choose to escalate, trying to grab more Ukrainian territory before any ceasefire. If he does, the world would witness an even bloodier phase of this war. And even if a ceasefire arrives, Ukraine, severely dismembered, may get destabilized and vulnerable to internal chaos. And history may ask, did Western powers and Ukraine's leadership miss the peaceful alternatives? Did their zeal to weaken Russia corner a nuclear power into paranoia? This is the uncomfortable truth. Powerful lobbies, the military-industrial complex, and anti-Russian hawks in Washington and Europe profit from unresolved conflicts. They are unlikely to let the war end quietly. So where does that leave us? With an unresolved conflict capable of dragging the world into a wider war? History teaches us when powerful nations choose weapons and egos over diplomacy, the innocent always pays the highest price. Stay tuned as next week we shift focus to the Middle East, another theater where unresolved tensions threaten to spiral out of control. Until then, this is the Globalheadwinds.com, wishing you a great weekend ahead.